to the Chapter 12 lecture on cognitive development in middle and late childhood. Our learning goals for this lecture, things you should focus on in your reading, what kind of cognitive changes are happening during this time frame. We're going to talk about intelligence and intelligence tests, and then also we're going to talk about dual language and second language learning. So if I don't talk about it in lecture, be sure you read that in your textbook. So the first thing we're going to talk about is continuing on with Piaget's stages of cognitive development. So for middle and late childhood, children are going to be in the concrete operational stage. So children can perform concrete operations, or in other words, operations that are applied to real objects and can reason logically, as long as that reasoning can be applied to specific or concrete examples. So one example I've heard is that if you asked children in elementary school to imagine what their life would be like had America not won its independence from Britain, they would not really be able to answer that question, because while they can think logically, that's not a really concrete example. So that kind of thinking appears in adolescence. Children at this age cannot answer questions like that. However, they can solve those conservation problems we talked about last time. So we're going to watch a video of that.
During the concrete operational stage, children begin to use logical instead of intuitive perception-bound reasoning. They are no longer fooled, for example, by Piaget's classic conservation tasks.
Do these two look like they're about the same amount? Okay, yeah. Good. Smash that. Are they still the same?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Do these two have the same? Yes. Yes, they still have the same amount.
When these children are asked why they believe that the taller glass or the flattened Play-Doh contains the same amount, their explanations illustrate that they are now able to decenter, or to think about more than one aspect of a problem at a time. They are able to follow the transformation from beginning to end and to mentally reverse the process, achieving a logical milestone that Piaget called reversibility.
Just because this glass was poured into there, just because this glass was poured into there doesn't mean that it isn't the same amount. It might be short a drop or so, but it's still the same amount. Because just because you flatten it doesn't mean it changes. Because it's all you did was just smash it down. It didn't change. This before was the shape, and just because this is flat now doesn't mean that it dropped mass or accumulated mass.
Okay, so as you could see, children at this age have accomplished the decentering process, which means they can solve those conservation problems. So if you remember from early childhood, when we watched those videos, they were fooled, and they would think that the flattened Play-Doh had less Play-Doh than the non-flattened one, or that the taller glass had more water than the shorter glass. So at this age, those problems no longer fool the children. They're easily solve these kinds of concrete problems that require logic. So that's Piaget and what's happening there. One more note on this. We talked about how children in early childhood are egocentric. They have egocentric thinking, which prevents them from solving these types of problems. So we watched the video with the mountain task. So older children, now in middle and late childhood, would easily be able to tell you what was on the other side of the mountain because they are less egocentric, have less egocentric thinking than children in early childhood, which also allows them to solve these types of problems. So we're going to move on to talking about information processing, which is one of our other cognitive theories. We've talked about this previously. So one thing that's happening here is that children's ability to sustain and control their attention has increased. So the ability to sit still and pay attention to one stimulus, or to concentrate and block distractions, brain is. So some other things to consider information processing is memory. So there are a couple different types of memory that you should know about. Your short-term memory, that is increasing during early childhood, but by around age 7, it shows less of an increase. So this is just information that you can hold in your short term for maybe like 30, 45 seconds. Once a memory is moved to long-term memory, that is relatively permanent. Also, we don't have a capacity limit on that. And your long-term memories are going to increase with age as well. With working memory, sometimes the textbooks will use the term short-term and working memory interchangeably. So you can do that as well. But working memory is kind of like your textbook describes it as a mental workbench. So this is where you bring information into your working memory and you manipulate and assemble that information in order to make decisions or solve problems or comprehend something. So I like to think about it in terms of taking a test. I think that's the easiest example. I've given you this example before. So you're studying, you're putting that information into your long-term memory. And when you sit down to take your test, you read the question and you have to pull those memories from long-term memory into short-term or working memory so that you can think through that information and figure out what the answer to the question is. So that's how memory works and how they kind of interact with each other. We will talk about some memory control strategies in a second. But one key aspect of working memory especially is those central executive functions. So things like the ability to pay attention and to block out distractors. That's really going to help with memory, not only of storing things in long-term memory, but also retrieving memories. Being able to plan your attention and decision making. Those are all things that develop as the child is aging due to their prefrontal cortex developing. So as their brain development gets more advanced, these types of abilities become more advanced as well. Okay, so then my next question is, what is the role of knowledge in memory? So this is a little intuitive because prior knowledge on a topic is going to improve your ability to understand and memorize new information about the topic. So for example, if you already know all the rules for soccer and they come out with a new rule that you don't know yet, you would be able to understand that information and also memorize that information faster than someone who knows nothing about soccer. So prior knowledge on a topic is going to help you memorize that information and understand that information as well. So when we look at how it affects children, of course, older children are more likely to be experts in different subjects than younger children are. That might be one difference in that older children have better memory than younger children, simply because they have more experience. they have more prior knowledge. Okay, so now let's talk about some memory control strategies. So this is another aspect of memory and how we can move information from short-term to long-term memory. So there are different ways you could go about this, and you probably use some of these already without knowing it, or maybe you learned it in Psych 101. But using some of these strategies is going to help a child remember information. So as they age, they become more aware of these strategies and they're better able to use these strategies effectively. So that is another reason why we see an increase in short-term and long-term memory as children are aging. So the first one is repetition. I'm not going to play the video for this one, but repetition is essentially just repeating information over and over. So I believe we discussed this one before, and if you're trying to remember a phone number, you will probably repeat it in your head until you get a chance to write it down or dial it. So that's repetition. So that moves them, whenever you are trying to remember when you're repeating the phone number, that is in your working memory. And in order to get it from working or short-term memory to long-term memory, you're repeating it over and over and over again so that it doesn't disappear after the 30 seconds or so that you can hold on to short-term memories. Elaboration is another one. This is where you're engaging in a more extensive processing of the information. So applying material to your personal life would be an example of elaboration. So you're elaborating on the material by applying it to your own personal life. So that a lot in these courses, where I'll ask you to think of a time that when you were a child that something happened to you, a memory that you have, or applying it to your life if you have children now. Seeing how you can apply it to information to real world situations. My example here with the Charlie Brown comic is that he is trying to remember his locker combination, and what he did was his locker combination, he connected it to famous baseball players. So he knew the numbers that baseball players wore, and so he was able to remember his locker combination by remembering the baseball player names. So that's something relevant to his life that he was able to use to remember information. So that's elaboration. With chunking, this is where you split information up into smaller pieces. So we see this when we remember phone numbers. So if you were trying to remember a phone number, and you know what, I'm not even going to try to do that. I'm just going to type it. And it was written like this. That would be really hard to remember. Because that phone number, that string of numbers has no meaning for you. It has no personal meaning, no higher meaning than just a random string of numbers. So it would be really hard for you to remember longer than maybe like 15 seconds. But if I write it like this, that becomes a lot easier to remember simply because of the dashes. So that's called chunking. So you can remember 3 pieces of information rather than this entire string of numbers. Does that I hope that makes sense, because basically what these dashes are doing is making your brain remember 3 separate pieces of information, which is way more manageable than remembering one long piece of information. So that's why we have phone numbers formatted this way. You see that with your social security card number, with your credit card number. We use chunking and all those kinds of things to make it easier. Lastly, you can create mental images to remember things. So I have another video clip to show you on this one. So give me just a second to switch my screen to that, and we will watch that video.
Grammarly does more than catch errors. With Grammarly, you can find really good, no, perfect words that make.
While it might be easy to recognize tweens growing older, predicting what their brains will do is not so simple. To gain insight to the tween brain, we're asking people on the boardwalk some questions about good.
Sorry, that was the wrong video. Let me reset this. I don't know what happened here. Sorry, guys, my computer is now not responding, so just fast forward through this. Keep fast forwarding. Okay, I might have to delete this and or stop this and create a part 2. Okay, so sorry about this, guys, but just keep fast forwarding. I'm trying to get back set up again. Okay, so I think this is going to work now. So here is our video.
Take a look at this random list of objects. You could try to memorize this list by reading it over and over, or try imagining this. The barn caught fire, and the dog saved the sleeping boy by dragging him by his pants to the mailbox. Now, take a moment to burn that scene into your brain. Okay, what were those 5 items we listed? Chances are you remembered all of them, but creating vivid images isn't the only way to boost your memory, as you're about to find out in this next game. Take a look at the number on your screen. Unless that number means something to you, your brain is already in the process of forgetting it. That's because short-term memory is a brief holding place for memories that have no long-term importance or emotional connection, but which might be useful in the immediate future. Like when you get the check at a restaurant. You only need to remember the total long enough to figure out the tip. A perfect job for your short-term memory, which lasts for no more than 30 seconds. So, how much was that bill we just showed you? Chances are you remember. But what about that 10-digit number we showed you earlier? Not only are those numbers outside your short-term memory's 30-second window, but there's also a cap on how much information can be stored there, usually around 4 or 5 items, which is why your brain still remembers this, but not this. The good news is you may be able to improve your short-term memory. All it takes is a dash of inspiration. To see what we mean, try to memorize this 10-digit number. Time's up. We'll give you a few seconds to let that sink in. Enjoy these elephants. Now, can you remember those numbers? Chances are you did, thanks to a technique called chunking, a simple tool we all use nearly every day.
Whether it's your social security number, credit card, or even your phone number, chunking longer number sequences into bite-sized pieces makes them much easier to remember. Simply adding a couple of dashes into a 10-digit number causes your brain to treat it as fewer items, putting less strain on your short-term memory.
Okay, so as you could see there, that gave you several different examples. That gave you several different examples of the strategies we were talking about. So hopefully that was a fun little game for you guys to follow along with. One note I did want to make with the short-term and working memory, the video mentioned we can only hold so much information. He's in the video said around 4 or 5. I think your textbook says about 7 for adults. For children, though, they hold less information in their working or short-term memory. So if we can hold 7, they can hold maybe 3 pieces of information. So their working capacity is not as large as ours as adults is going to be. That increases with age. So I'm going to skip now to talking about intelligence. So this is a really interesting topic that I hope is just as interesting online as it would have been in person. So one thing we have to talk about with intelligence is what actually is intelligence. What do we mean when we say someone is intelligent? So think about that for a second and what kind of things you would consider when you think about an intelligent person. Is it that they're able to solve problems? Is it that they have a certain degree level? Are they creative? There's many different ways you could go about defining intelligence, which is one of the issues with studying intelligence or measuring intelligence, is that there's not just one simple definition. And that becomes a real issue whenever we're using intelligence tests in schools, to determine student placement, which we'll get to here in a little bit. But just keep that in mind while we talk about these different types of intelligence tests. I just want to give you a brief history before we get to that. So for the most part, a general definition of intelligence is problem-solving skills and the ability to learn from and adapt to life's everyday experiences. So if you're able to solve problems and also learn from past experiences and implement that information in the future. There actually has been some research that's found a gene associated learning. And if the gene is turned off, they did a study on mice, then the mouse does not learn. So they do it as a shock study where if the mouse has the learning gene, when they hear a white noise, they experience a shock. So that mouse will learn to associate the shock with the white noise. But the mouse that has their learning gene turned off never learns that association. And they've actually found that we most likely have that gene as well. So it's really interesting. So the first intelligence test was created all the way back in 1904 by Alfred Binet. They developed the test in order to help schools identify children with learning difficulties. So that's important to understand, is that this first intelligence test was designed to identify children with learning difficulties. So that means it's not designed to be able to determine if somebody has a really high intelligence. It's designed to find the children that have difficulties. So you've probably heard of an IQ score. So part of what Binet did was he developed the concept of a mental age, which is an individual's level of mental development relative to others. So you have, when you are calculating your IQ score, what you would do is you would divide your mental age by your chronological age and then multiply that times 100. So your chronological age is just how old you are. So if I'm 26, my mental age would be essentially what I scored on the intelligence test. So if I scored a mental age of 12, I would divide that by my chronological age of 26 and multiply that by 100, and then you get your intelligence score. That's how they're calculated. Okay, so there are different types of intelligence tests. So the first one is the Stanford-Binet test. So this is a variation or essentially a revision of Binet's original test. And the Stanford part got added in because they revised it at Stanford. So with the Stanford-Binet test, you're going to see a general measure of intelligence involving problem-solving skills and things like that. I'm going to skip ahead 1 second just to show you this chart that's in your textbook. So this is our what is called a normal distribution or a bell curve. So when we're measuring IQ scores, everybody in the population, everyone in the world is going to fall somewhere under this curve. So if you took an IQ test, it would give you a score that would fall somewhere under here. So you can see that where it is average, because that means that your mental ability and your mental age and your chronological age are the same. So that's average. Most people are there. On this side, you have higher IQ scores, which go into having a superior IQ and a gifted IQ. Over here, we have lower scores, which go into intellectual disabilities. So just understand that everybody would fall somewhere in here, and most people fall between 85 and 115. Okay, let me go back. So the other test I wanted to talk about was the Wechsler. So the Wechsler scale provides an overall IQ, but it also provides 5 different composite scores. So the Wechsler scale is going to measure verbal comprehension, working memory, processing speed, fluid reasoning, and visuospatial intelligence. So this way, an administrator can easily see if an individual is struggling in a specific area. So with Stanford Binet, you get 1 score total. Even though it throws in those same different measurements, different areas, you just get 1 score. With Wechsler, you get an overall score and 5 different composite scores. So this would be really helpful for children, so you could determine what areas they need focus on. This picture is an example of something that would be in the visuospatial aspect of the test, where you're asked to define, pick which parts would make this image here. So you'll see different things like that. This test can be given at different ages, and the types of items you'll see on the test will vary depending on age. So we talked about infant intelligence a while back and what that would look like. So once we get to elementary school, this is where you're going to see more of the pen and paper tests like this. Now, these tests are going to be used a lot of the time in schools to determine who gets to go into the gifted classes and who needs extra help, and maybe even go into the special education classes. So that's why these are really important, and why it's important to determine if they're fair tests, if they're actually measuring intelligence or not, because that sets the kid up for future class experiences. So we'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end as well. So let's talk about different types of intelligence. So that is one of the main issues with measuring intelligence, is that those tests we just talked about, the Stanford Binet and the Wechsler, are measuring mostly problem type skills. And I don't think, and a lot of researchers don't think, that that's a full picture of what intelligence is. So this Sternberg's triarchic theory, he includes creative intelligence, for example. So creativity isn't included in those standard intelligence tests, and practical intelligence, of just being able to think logically in a practical situation, essentially. This one is really interesting, the Gardner's 8 frames of mind. This chart here displays that. So what his theory is that there are different types of intelligence. So you might be nature smart, for example, or you might be a picture smart, which means like you have good visuospatial intelligence. You might be medically smart. You might be bodily smart. You might be good at sports, for example. You might be really good at connecting with people, or really good at understanding yourself. So you can go around and look at all of these. But essentially what this is saying is that you don't have to be great in everything. Every individual is going to be high in one area and lower in others. And these types of things are not measured on those on your average intelligence test. So that really think about that and what that means. Whenever we're labeling someone as low IQ, high IQ, is that an accurate measurement of their intelligence? I'm going to post this video for you to watch on your own, and it talks about IQ tests and racism. It's really important and really interesting, so you can kind of see, again, some of the issues that come along with giving IQ tests. So one thing I will mention here is that when you talk about the difference in IQ, so the difference between a child who has a low IQ and a child who has a high IQ, that is an issue because we don't have a great idea, first of all, of what intelligence is, but also we know that these tests are not culturally fair, which means that in our country, higher SES students and white students perform better on these IQ tests than minority students. Now, knowing that, does that mean that white students are just smarter than minority students? And the answer to that is no, that's not what it means. There might be, first of all, issues with the test not being fair. So the questions would skew towards the audience of white middle upper class students and not towards minorities, which means that those students the white students have an unfair advantage in being able to answer those questions on the test. So one thing researchers can do is create a culturally fair test. So that makes everything basically levels the playing field and would make it more accurate. There's not such a thing right now. It's really hard to do, but that is something to look at. So if you're not really fully understanding how an IQ test would be culturally unfair, an example would be if I were to give you a test about, let's see, if you lived in the country and you had no experience being in a city at all, and I were to give you a test about how to use the subway system, and then I was going to use your score on that test to tell you if you have a high IQ or a low IQ, you would likely not do well on that test, which means you would end up in my low IQ category. Now, you know that you don't have a low IQ, so that means that test is unfair, and that test favors people who live in the city. So it's that same thing. And we see that with SES status and race. So if you can look at scores for by SES status, you'll see that the difference really isn't racial. It's more about SES status. So if you look at compare Black students that are high SES and Black students that are low SES, the high SES students are going to perform better on IQ tests than the low SES students, no matter what race they are. Okay, lastly, we are going to talk we have 2 more slides. So we're going to talk about intellectual disabilities and the intellectually gifted. Again, I'm going to post this video for you to watch on the least restrictive environment. This is just talking about the best way that children with disabilities and intellectual disabilities can best be accommodated in schools. Let me see what else I want to tell you on this. So your textbook goes over the different ranges of intellectual disabilities. You can read that on your own. One note I do want to make is that some intellectual disability is genetic, so it might run in families, and some of it may be caused by some disorders such as Down syndrome, or if the mother maybe used drugs or alcohol during pregnancy. So those are things we've talked about before that have a cognitive effect later on in life. Okay, so with gifted and talented, this means that these people have above average intelligence. So they might be put in gifted and talented classes. So I know I didn't do these classes, but my brother did in elementary school, and they were sent a couple days a week to a different school to do harder work, essentially. So really happening is children are being separated, whether you're high intelligence or low intelligence, you're being separated from the main classroom, which the idea is that you get more intensive instruction. And like my brother was always bored in the regular classroom because he was pretty much ahead of everybody else. So then that was better for him to go where he could get more intense instruction. But that's also creating social and emotional issues whenever you're separating children out like that. So there are some issues there with the gifted and talented program. Okay, so last slide, we're going to talk about English language learners. So English language learners are students who are entering school with either little or no English proficiency, which means that they may have a slow academic progress and they might be isolated from their peers. So this also causes challenges for educators in how to educate these children who may not speak any English at all. So there's 2 different approaches. The first one is bilingual education. So this is where children are initially taught in their native language, and at the same time, they're learning English. So they would, if they're learning science for the day, they would first do the lesson in Spanish, if that's their native language. In Texas, it most likely is. So we'll say they're learning science, and they're going to learn that lesson in Spanish, and they also are learning English throughout the day as well, so that eventually once they have a better understanding of English, they can learn fully in English. The second option is immersion or English only education, which basically just means that you have this student who doesn't speak a lot of English or speaks no English at all, and you put them in the classroom with everyone else, so they are only learning in English. So clearly that can cause some problems because they're going to be way behind. Just imagine for a moment if you entered a class where they were speaking a language that you did not understand and you're expected to learn just the same as everybody else. So honestly, I don't see how this is even an option. I know children learn language faster than we do as adults, but they're going to be so behind. So the best way to go is the bilingual education. And you actually can see schools where they do it both ways. So they have the Spanish speakers learning English, but they also have the English speakers learning Spanish. So that's a really cool option as well. And being bilingual actually has cognitive advantages. It creates higher self-esteem. You tend to see higher scores on IQ tests. And so an instruction in a native language is definitely going to enhance their ability to learn. And I have another video down here for that too, and I'll post that as well since the videos aren't working too well. So I'll post those separately for you to watch. You don't have to if you don't want to, but it will supplement the lecture. So like usual, if you have further questions, please definitely let me know in office hours or through email.